I am Sarah Kirk, and thank you for joining me for this webinar about the ASCA Ethical Standards for School Counselors. This is an update to a previous webinar that I recorded about the ASCA Ethical Standards. And today's webinar will just be a hopefully fairly quick update because we have a brand new revision of the ASCA ethical standards that have now been published. So I want to make sure you have that information. Now, in my previous webinar, which I encourage you to go back and watch, I really discussed all of the important elements of where these ethical standards fit into the national model in that define component. We talked about how important ethical standards are to our profession because they really help us to maintain that standard of integrity, leadership, and professionalism. I also talked about how these are used as a guide for our decision making in this profession. And they're also a really strong advocacy tool to help other stakeholders understand our role within the school and what our professional organization says we should do in regards to a variety of ethical and legal dilemmas. In that previous webinar, we went over the ethical standards. We dug through them just a little bit. And like I said, we now have an updated version. So I wanted to share those with you and also share about some of the updates that you will find in there. I just got back from the ASCA annual conference down in Austin, Texas, and I was fortunate to get to hear from the ASCA Ethics Committee, which is comprised of the one and only Dr. Carolyn Stone, Dr. Wendy Rock, and Dr. Haley Wyckoff. And they presented several times at the conference about these updates, and I wanted to share some of that with you all so that you'll also know what to expect out of this new revision. So, as we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what the committee shared with us about how these changes came about. So the committee, Dr. Rock, Dr. Stone, and Dr. Wyckoff, really made sure to dive deep into school counselors and school counselors leaders' feedback into what changes were needed. They also did a lot of revamping to really keep up with where education is today and where our profession is today. So as we dive into these new set of standards, you will see several different changes that the committee identified and really emphasized in this new revision. And I think that you're going to find it incredibly beneficial. I think that this revision is quite amazing, if you ask me. But like I was saying, they did not do this alone. They sought out the advice and the opinions and the recommendations from school counselors in all 50 states. They worked with the state school counselor associations to form different groups that led the work to represent the nation and to really represent all school counselors' unique needs and what we need to do to support all students' unique needs. That committee worked really hard. I know they were meeting multiple times a week to really make sure that this revision meets our needs. And we are so grateful for their really comprehensive work. And again, I think that you'll find that the product is quite impressive. The ethical standards also were open for public comment for about a month, and the committee met and also put some of that public comment incorporated into this latest revision. So it really went through a thorough process before it reached all of us. Now that it has reached all of us, you are going to see that there is some changes in just some of the wording. It is a more action-oriented document now. So many of the statements maybe didn't change their meaning, but they did become action-oriented, which I always like. I think that makes it easier to really digest and to hold on to, and obviously easier to implement when we can read it in that action-oriented language. You'll also see a strong emphasis on making the standards more inclusive and a strong emphasis on the safe school environment and what we do to make sure that that is a reality for our kids, that we are working towards the safest possible environment in our schools, ensuring equity for all students. And again, you're going to see a strong emphasis in the language throughout the document, really emphasizing those points now. You'll also see some language updates in regards to the latest ASCA National Model language, just to keep up with all of those changes. Some of the standards expanded, they needed more detail, and some got smaller. They needed to be made more concise. So they made those changes as well. There was a few changes on the order of the standards just to increase the flow and the readability. 2 of the standards were eliminated completely, and 34 were added. So you're going to find that this new document is much more comprehensive in scope. Now, let's go ahead and dive in and talk through some of those changes. Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive presentation of every single change made, so please make sure you print this new copy, you read it carefully, you keep it somewhere safe, and reference it often. But I will go through some of the major changes so that you can make sure and highlight or circle or really be aware of some of those more major changes. Let me get this shared with you. All right, so you should be able to see these brand new ethical standards on your screen. You can see here adopted in 2022, just this summer, replacing the previous standards that were published in 2016. These are revised on a 6-year cycle, so we can expect new ones again in 2028, which, scary enough, will be here probably before we know it. All right, so let's talk about some of those changes you'll see. In this preamble and purpose, which I talk about in my previous webinar about the importance of the preamble and the purpose, I think that this is information we should be sharing with stakeholders. I think that we should have this on our websites and on important documents, and at least bits and pieces of it made known to our stakeholders and to our students, because I really think it sets the foundation for our role in schools and to serve students. You'll see some changes in the preamble, a little bit of new wording, some language updates, again, really emphasizing safety and inclusivity and the healthy school environment. You'll see some changes and some additions in language about equitable access to school counseling programs. We know that that is so important. It always has been, but really clearly defining that here in this new set of standards. Once we get into section A, there's quite a few changes. So let's go over some of the changes you'll find in this section A that really talks about our responsibility to all students. So kind of overall, again, some of the same themes. You'll see a greater emphasis on equity, on safe and inclusive school environments. We're really focusing on that idea that we want to create environments where all students thrive, and that is our role in the schools. So you'll see some of those changes kind of overarching throughout this section. Also, throughout this section, you'll see some changes in language in regards to person-first language, which I really appreciate. I'm really trying to decrease that deficit language and seeing students as something wrong with them. That trauma-informed lens, I think, is really important, and we want that to be reflected in our ethical standards. You'll also see a stronger emphasis on our personal biases and being aware of those as we work to provide a culturally sustaining school counseling programs. All right, so let's dive into some specifics that you'll find in here. So in section A, you will first find, again, there's some little changes I'm not going to go over, just some little wording and things like that. But in A4 is the first one we'll go over. So let me scroll down there. And in A4, you're going to find 2 brand new standards. E and F are both brand new down here at the bottom. And E and F have been added to really emphasize, again, that importance of addressing personal biases and addressing inequitable systemic policies and practices. So you'll find both of those added to A4. In A5, you'll also find brand new standards added. So let's get to A5. A5A is brand new here. A5B is brand new. And A5G and J are also brand new. G is important, always has been. Remember, when we talk about our ASCA ethical standards, they are such an important document. However, they're not exhaustive and they're not prescriptive. They're aspirational. They are rooted in reality, but we do know that we must adhere to our district and school policies as well. And so keep that in mind, especially in today's climate, as we are having more legislation and different changes occur. We want to make sure that we remember that piece as well. All right, let's see what else changes we can find in this section. All right, we talked about A5, got 4 new standards. A7 also got 3 new standards. So let's go down. That's that group work section. So A7 group work, let's see, A, B, and G are brand new. So you can see here that idea of culturally sustaining group counseling, equitable access to groups is important as well, and making sure that we're reflecting on our group outcomes and to make adjustments as needed. I think those 3 additions are fantastic. I love it. I love it. I love it. A8 also has 3 brand new standards. So you will find A, D, and E brand new here. So this is that those student peer support programs. So make sure you review those as well. Now, A9, I want to spend some time talking about this A9, serious and foreseeable harm to self and others. This is one of the ethical standards that is probably accessed and asked about most frequently. So there is some really important new language here. So what we have added here in B is that we recognize that the level of suicide risk is difficult to accurately quantify. So previously, we've talked about those levels of risks, and sometimes school counselors are asked to identify those levels of risk. So this is an important one to share with your school principals, your administrators, your school leaders who are asking you to do suicide risk assessments and maybe asking you to identify a level of suicide risk, because as this clearly states, that's really difficult, and research has shown it's difficult and very rarely accurately quantified in that way. It goes on to say that if required to use a risk assessment, it must be completed with the realization that this is just information gathering. It's just one element in the risk assessment process. You can go on and again read more about reporting those risk assessment results and really some important elements that we want to keep in mind with any risk assessment. So if you are currently in charge of risk assessments, make sure that is really, really clear and make sure your principals understand this language. I think that is, it's just so important. We're so often asked to make a judgment call and to work really outside of our scope in those scenarios. So keep that in mind. Some additional changes in this A9 are on A9D. And again, that just adds that culturally responsive piece. So you'll see here that we've added the importance of culturally responsive mental health resources. A10 also has some changes. The title changed completely, so it's now called Marginalized Populations here. So you'll see that title change. And then 2 new standards added as well. G and H are brand new. Again, reflecting, let's get to them. They're kind of split up. Here's G, and that importance of inclusion. And then in H, you'll see that advocate for the systemic changes that are needed. So those two, again, emphasize safe, equitable, affirming school environments and that equitable access and inclusion for all students. A11 also changed quite a bit. That section title also changed. You'll see here it's now called Bullying, Harassment, Discrimination, Bias, and Hate Incidents. Previously, it included child abuse in there, and it didn't include discrimination, bias, and hate incidents. So it makes a little more sense now, and child abuse has its own section now. But also in A11, in addition to the new title, there are 6 new standards added, which I think is really great to really thoroughly describe this section that we know so many of our students are experiencing. And so A, B, C, E, F, and H are all brand new in there. So make sure you carefully read this A11 and make sure that our programs and our systems are in place to make sure we are addressing each of those new areas. This section also changed a bit to really recognize that race, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity are all factors when it comes to bullying, harassment, discrimination, bias, and hate incidents. We also added some information about policies that can be centered in safety, belonging, and justice. Excuse me, and accessible and effective reporting tools, and then also added some language regarding prevention and response, which I love. Like I said, A12 now has its own section, which is great. It fits a little better there than added in with A11. A15 added a few new standards as well. That's that one about technical and digital citizenship. So G, H, and I are brand new there. And that really talks about equitable access. Again, some of the things we learned from COVID, that not all of our students do have equitable access to technology. So we made sure to advocate or to add language about advocating for that as well. And then also some information about the challenges with confidentiality when it comes to technical and digital citizenship. Lastly, A16, the virtual and distance school counseling added one new standard to address students who are considering suicide in a virtual setting. So that is a helpful addition there. And goodness, aren't we glad we had those ethical standards when COVID-19 happened. I was just so grateful that our ethics committee has been so forward thinking that we already had that in place and really only needed a small change there to really continue to keep up with where we are, which is pretty amazing. All right, let's jump to B. Not as many changes in B, but there is some language updates and some new standards. B1, I knew this was coming and I'm so glad it did, but we got a new standards relating to PPRA, which most of you have probably heard about. Let's see which one is PPRA. I believe it's E and F. Let's see. I can't remember which one it is, but this new section B1 with responsibility to parents and guardians does address that importance of PPRA and also again updates that language to be more inclusive and culturally responsive. B2, B3, not a lot of big changes, just some language updates. So we'll shift through those. And C, again, updated language, adding that equity and access piece, making sure that our programs are comprehensive and the data we use is comprehensive. Those were just some of the the little changes. There were some new standards added to Section C. When you get to G, H, I, and J, those are all new, G, H, I, and J. So this whole section is new, and I think are really important when we think about the services that school counseling directors, administrators, and supervisors provide. So be sure and read that as well. All right, Section D. Some updated language here, mostly again the same that we've talked about previously, and not any big changes. There were some additions added about the use of data, making sure that our school counseling practicum and internship site supervisors are helping future school counselors learn about that importance of data, and the importance of consulting with school administrators, and really making sure that that cultural competency is emphasized. There is one new standard there, which is in. So right here at the bottom, in is brand new. Again, just kind of emphasizing those different roles. So that is overall the, I believe, let me see, minor tweaks in Section E. That one doesn't have a lot of changes. Oh, ethical decision making. Glad I kept scrolling. I almost forgot. This part did change a little bit. So they have added a new step to our ethical decision making model. And it also has more models referenced in this section now, which I think is fantastic. That will be really helpful for students who are in need of that. So you can see here, there are other ones listed, but there's also still the steps included here. But B is a brand new step in the ethical decision-making model, which is an important one, making sure we're identifying those potential cultural, religious, and worldview factors when we are faced with an ethical dilemma. All right. A couple of the other steps were changed a little bit there, but not, oh yes, one more was brand new. K is brand new. So this step, identifying any inconsistencies in school and district policy, was also added, which is an important one. So really thorough ethical decision-making model here, and again, lists some others if you need those for your specific situation. All right, there are also some new definitions added. I think like 15 or so new definitions added to our glossary of terms. So that is very helpful too, just becoming more comprehensive in scope, more inclusive of the language that we're using in schools and that we want all school counselors to be aware of. So those are a review of the changes. Again, make sure that you take a look and print out those new standards. They can be found by a quick Google search, ASCA Ethical Standards. Just make sure it's that 2022 revision version, and print a couple copies. Make sure they're handy. Share them with your administrator. I think it's really powerful to go over some of those important elements with your administrator to make sure you're on the same page when it comes to these ethical dilemmas that we find ourselves in, specifically some of those we talked about that seem to come up often, and there seems to not always be clarity in regards to the school counselor's role. So think of these as a preventative tool also. I think often we fall back on our ethical standards when we're in a dilemma, but the more we can be preventative with them, the more we can lay a strong foundation using these standards, the less likely we are to find ourselves in a dilemma or to find ourselves in a situation that's uncomfortable for us, or that's not good for students, or that's not good for our school community. So think of these as a reactive tool as needed, but also as a way to be preventative in the supports we provide. I hope this was helpful. As I mentioned, make sure you go back and watch the other video that really talks about why ethical standards are so important and where they fit in our implementation of a comprehensive school counseling program. And I will see you all again soon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.